Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another part three episode of How Can We Turn These Generic Topics into a Design Thesis Project. I'm your host, Naziaty Yaacob, and we shall look at the rest of the topics. And the topics are strategies for revitalizing aging infrastructure in rural areas, examining the relationship between landscape and architecture in urban spaces, exploring the role of cultural identity in the design of public spaces, and investigating the impact of green building design on energy efficiency. I'd like to cover these four topics and how the seemingly generic topics that are more akin to dissertation topics can be changed or can translate into design thesis, which is specific to design problems. And when it is thought of in terms of the site and context, it is easier to actually deal these topics as design thesis topics. Okay, so what we have here, the first one is aging infrastructure in rural areas. What are the strategies? So when we think about rural areas, we think about villages, and the infrastructure in villages relate to the ecosystem or the traditional lifestyle of people in the rural areas. And when I think about the Malaysian context, immediately I think of the traditional Malay houses in rural areas where we don't talk only about the building, we talk about how the livelihood, the way of living, the cultural aspects, and even the social aspects of being a villager, and how, in terms of what work they do, which is a livelihood, really. Many of them are farmers. And I'm not going to go into what type of farmers, but traditionally it exists on its own, and people didn't really have to go to towns and cities because they have their own way of life, and it suits them fine, and even have festivities and social gatherings in rural areas. So when we think about aging infrastructure, the first thing I'm thinking of are the change in these rural areas where developers or people who normally develop in the cities are coming to more rural parts of the country and build speculative development there, which is not really doing things in a subtle way, or in respecting or strategically helping with the economy. Is just imposing on the existing landscape. And the new structures, how are they sympathetic or fit into this existing landscape in the rural areas, is something else. But we are focusing on the revitalizing of the aging infrastructure. Is it adding tourism products or tourism objectives help to revitalize the aging infrastructure, which is what is happening in certain parts where a lot of tourists come to the beaches and they like the city centers and the different things that they could look into, maybe nature, for example, in Langkawi. So traditional houses are less and less, obviously, and they even create new traditional houses to make it as a tourist product, where you have homestays and you have itineraries where people can come and cook the traditional food and so on. So it is about how happy are people, are people happy? When we focus this as something to do with the impact of tourism, for example, whether that's a good thing or not, and are there alternatives other than tourism injection, tourism activities in rural areas? When we look at tourism, is that a good model? So I've always thought that how the Balinese people cope with this is a good example. How they would put up policies to maximize the height of buildings, for example, to be built. And I heard that the building must not be higher than the highest coconut tree or something, or the highest tree in the land. The strong belief of the land, the valley, and the mountain, and how natural phenomena or the natural landscape should be maintained as much as possible was the idea behind that tourism strategy in Bali. Excuse me. So, and when you look at traditional houses, even in Malaysian traditional houses, you can see the old ones and the new ones and the relatively new ones. And it's just a way of building them based on certain principles that were more relevant before. On stilts, for example, there was the issue of flooding and wild animals and ventilating the underneath the building. But it came down a bit and become more of bungalows where you don't have the stilts, but you still get up onto steps and a certain height when you get to the front entrance that you need to go up the certain steps, but not that high, and enough of ventilation that could come in to the underside. So environmental science and typology or architectural precedents come together in one, and also building material, obviously. So revitalizing means certain principles need to still be there. Air conditioning or sealing up the building would be detrimental to the idea of revitalizing this aging Malay traditional houses, because it's all about ventilation, really. Ventilation in so many ways, not only the one that I mentioned, but in other ways. The way that it is designed and embellished also produce in this sort of aesthetics that you can't find elsewhere. So if you want to have air conditioning, of course you want to seal it with glass or with non-ventilated material that need to be able to open and out then. So the design problem is obvious that for strategies for revitalizing aging infrastructure in rural areas include planning, include planning, urban planning. It's not urban planning, it's rural planning. Includes water bodies, traditional land use and modern land use, and what is the story? Is it to do with agriculture? Then you would think about eco-agriculture or something, or permaculture. And how do you actually deal with the greening of the rural area? If you want to say that now the situation is there's no planning, so you're going to turn into what are the strategies and how people own lands. And the traveling distance would be far in terms of working. And it could review existing policies or programs in Malaysia, such as the FELCRA and FELDA. There are going to be planning issues that the architect has to deal with if it's going to be a design thesis, right down to the communal spaces and traditional houses. And what is the new traditional house? Could it be that there are other things that you need to design for, and maybe a disaster management aspect of how some aging infrastructure is having those challenges in terms of climate change. But it's not a climate change a topic, but it's what are you revitalizing these houses and these infrastructure for? What is it? How is it going to be sustainable? So, of course, you can add in other factors in to make it much more complex, your design thesis. But I would think that there are a lot to chew in this topic. The second topic, which is examining the relationship between landscape and architecture in urban spaces. In the context of a tropical country like Malaysia, in urban spaces, this is a big issue where the distance, the height, the proportions of in-between spaces. I would even look at this in activities, where you can examine different types of buildings. What type of building do you want to deal with? Because in my mind, I have a certain type of building. What type of building? Is it housing? Is it low-rise or medium-rise housing? Is it office buildings or mixed-use development, or shop houses, the new shop houses? Last time, the shop houses was designed a certain way to maximize on the land use, but in a way limiting the built form to 3 stories high. But if you were to create a higher density and say, okay, maximum 5 stories, then how are you going to design the landscape and architecture, the in-between spaces in this respect? Is it different typologies that you need to adopt from different countries and to explore this in the tropical context? So in-between spaces become the special studies of the how you explore the relationship between landscape and architecture, but determine first what is the building typology that you are looking into, and in what context and what site. Taking an existing site and trying to regenerate or create adaptive reuse something could be interesting, but the complexity of the design problem becomes much bigger and complex. But having one that is totally new, or getting to clear out some of the spaces in existing space, finding the site is kind of interesting, because the linkages or the experience between one in-between space to another in-between space. Now you're focusing in-between space as not a leftover space, but the activity is purposely done, or that even if it's accidental, it provide the design in detail, would provide, the designer saw the importance of the sense of space and giving the sense of character to the whole development. Going to the third, that was quick for number 6. I think you can take any, looking back at number 6, examining the relationship between landscape and architecture in urban space. You could also imagine, explore with very strong building types like hospital, or where the size of the rooms could be smaller, or in clusters, and schools. Because there are certain things that can be done in the in-between space that is not normally done in other spaces. This is very purposeful, intentional, that you choose the potential of a certain building type that could generate much more interesting spaces for the in-between spaces. I rarely see the relationship between landscape and architecture in a tropical country having to deal with getting nature in. And how it's oriented as well, with relation to the sun patterns and shadows, and especially the microclimate situation at a certain time of the day where you could use the space, even if it's right in midday, if that can happen, because that was one of the design problem that we have now, that during midday you cannot really use the spaces because it's too hot. But what if you can create a space that people would use during midday, like having a lunch break somewhere? And if you could do it by using architecture and the positioning it in such a way that you cast shadows and is well ventilated, you don't even have to do put artificial membranes and stuff like that, which you will depend upon your sense of material, your sense of orientation, and other aspects that is sensorial, or to do with physicality and to do with the feel of it, much akin to phenomenological sensibilities in some of the architecture design done before by others, but in a tropical climate. So you can find precedents of architects that have done this before. Yeah, another thing is meditative space, Zen spaces, or the realization of a problem that you you can translate to architecture. Like in an office building, if I'm so stressed out, how do I actually meditate? And is that a space that I can meditate quickly or I can inspire from? And how does the purpose of that happen in a busy office space area? So there could be all this design problem that you can come up with. So going into the next topic is exploring the role of cultural identity in the design of public spaces. Well, anything to do with identity, there's so many identities. When we talk about human being, there's so many identities. But when you talk about inanimate objects, how does that inanimate objects, such as architecture or art or sculpture, how does it actually relate to you? And how does the design could relate to a culture? Cultural identity means that you identify it and say, this is a space that feels relating to a culture. So what is the culture in mind? So the whole investigation of the culture needs to be done. If you impose the Mahmeri culture, or you impose the Mandailing, Sumatran Mandailing culture, or the Minangkabau culture, some of these cultures are not identifiable, even though a person could come from the Mandailing tribe, or their ancestors come from Mandailing tribe. They have a Mandailing name, for example, but what is that Mandailing identity to them now is something else. Because when you talk about identity, maybe a much more modern identity is important. Artists, for example, I identify myself as an artist. I identify myself as an architect. Or, I identify myself as a watercolorist. I identify myself as a craftsperson that wants to bring alive the craft, Malay traditional craft of the past. And I work on materials such as timber, and but with the idea that these crafts that I do are part of household products. Now, it's like there is a narrative to culture, because, you ask yourself, like I'm asking myself, for example, as a Malay person born in Malaysia, of Malay ethnicity, for example, and and I found out that I am from the Rawa community in Sumatra, and Minang community in Sumatra as well, from my different lineages. And but it's nothing to me. I do not feel anything towards this identity that comes from inherited from my ancestors, for example. And I don't, apart from eating Malay food, I like to eat Malay food because it's something familiar and comforting. But I equally like other food, we can say Chinese food or Indian food or whatever. But of course, when we eat something, Indian food, it could be a chettinad, or it could be from northern parts of India, and and have different spices in it. So those are the starting point. When you talk about cultural identity, you gotta find out which culture that you're gonna look into. Obviously, if you ask this question during the academic year, you waste a lot of time trying to find which cultural identity that you want to deal with. So then here in this topic, it says exploring the role of cultural identity in the design of public spaces. So quite obviously, I've remembered projects such as the Chinese Performing Arts, or just Performing Arts Center near Chinatown in Petaling Street area. I remember that project, and one of the students did that. And the investigation of what is Chinese culture, and in the context of Malaysia, came out, of course, and how the student need to translate the aspirations or translate the programs that closely would deal with the Chinese cultural identity, in particular of the Petaling Street, Malaysia. Petaling Street, or that area could have more. When you talk about ethnicity, Chinese, the ethnicity, they have many, of course, Hakka, and Cantonese, Hokkien, those are the languages. So Teochew and all these languages and tribes or clans that are related to that space. There's a heritage aspects to thing in that, so you'd identify places that have been there more than 100 years ago, or even better, 200 years ago. And these spaces, I'm trying to think of other projects. Like I said about Kampung Baru is a Malay village, so how are you going to deal with the cultural identity of Kampung Baru, for example? So obviously the building type, like a cultural center or performing arts or school of martial arts or something, not necessarily martial arts, but school, but then it also lends to the community around it. Who is going to use that building? Is that for tourists or is that for the community? Oh, that reminds me of one particular project which is very interesting by Gin Yong that dealt with three things: the elderly community, of the old town in Malacca near the Jonker Street area, the elderly community, the health aspects. The medicine hall is quite prominent in terms of the program. The elderly care center or elderly center that has some sort of facility for healthcare and daycare. And third was that some of the elderly people could actually work in the budget hotel. So that was a three program that seems to be convincing in a part where they're in existence. About 70% of people are older persons and they are of the Chinese ethnicity. So that was a successful design thesis, in my opinion, at that time. So yeah, you can come up with 3 different programs. It doesn't have to be one program, Performing Arts Center. It wouldn't have worked if you had that in that site, because that's just kind of a smallish site, And it's a site that faces Stadhuis or the Dutch buildings on the other side. But you cannot ignore the community, because whenever you do a project in Malacca, which is a tourist destination, you have a project that deals with the community, and that is much more in keeping with, much more interesting, in fact, with the different dimensions of how the impact of making income generating for the elderly people, as well as sustaining their livelihood, or their need to have some income, though they are living in an area which is overrun by tourist products. Now, I have a few minutes for the last topic, and I managed to get into the last topic now, and I'm proud of myself, and thank you for listening thus far. The last one, last but not least, number 8, is investigating the impact of green building design on energy efficiency. Whenever people talk about energy efficiency and green building design, and I would want to put out case studies of off-grid living. When we talk about an individual living by themselves off-grid and somewhere in the rural area or in the forest or in areas where they need to support themselves by shooting and hunting, or farming and living off the land, it is a contrast to what's happening to myself, people like myself living in cities where I can go out and get myself lunch, breakfast, or dinner easily. So what is the impact of me getting breakfast, lunch, and dinner easily? The organic and inorganic ways, where does it go? It is, when we always talk about green building design, to me it's a bit fascist. Fake? Sorry, I think I'm going to use the word fake. Because the word green building, we're not focusing on the people, we're not focusing on the system of how we exist, how we use a building or facility. When the standardization in mid 20th century, back then, we created standardization of space, of the dimensions of space based on any environmental science or thermal comfort and usage of space, why you determine certain space so that you can do certain activities. Very much a personal thing, but then you have standardization. So, okay, we'll sell you 900 square feet of flat. And of course, the permutation is, I can have 2 people living in it, or I can have 1 person living in it, or I can have 3 people living in it. A family, which is a young couple and a child, or I can have an elderly person with a few cats. I mean, that would suit the 900 square feet of unit of space. And how is that? In this one unit, you have replicate many other units, and then you have a building or a block. When you talk about impact of green building design on energy efficiency, is it in terms of dwellings, private accommodations, or public buildings? Or would you want to take an area where it's like a housing estate, and you look into the master planning of how efficient the design is in terms of layout, orientation of the sun, the different units, and how it is called green? It is defining and redefining green building. The design thesis project, if you take a typology I mean, you can take a hospital. You can take a medium-rise hospital spread out, which is better than a high-rise hospital. But hospital is very technical. So you have all these other things about rehabilitation and efficiency as well. But what would be the building typology that you want to investigate the impact of green building design on energy efficiency? Obviously, to me, is condominium or flats, and also the activities and how certain the unit with the area of living space, the dimensions, the climate, everything will have to be stitched together. And there are so many design problems there already when you talk about housing. And housing seems to be prevalent. This is going to the conclusion of all these topics. People don't usually do housing as a design thesis because that's what the lecturers think, that there's too many design problems. They don't express it that way. But when you talk about design problem in design thesis, when there's like 20 design problems compared to another thesis that has probably 10 design problems or even less, obviously housing project is deemed so complex that for sure it is a design thesis. But to take on a housing design project for the design thesis is a big challenge, yes. And you're not looking for the perfect grade here. You're looking for a exhilarating experience of discoveries and finding out more and more design problems to tackle, and it will really keep you busy for that year. So yeah, housing project would always be like that. And all these topics that we have from 1 to 10, many of them would be ideal for a housing project. For a mixed-use development, it could be done as well in terms of the densities, in terms of how it can knit together or create another sense of place because of its order and proportion and composition of the mixed-use development. Because when we talk about that, we're talking about residential come commercial come even other aspects, community facilities. When we talk about elderly housing, specific to a demographic, or when we talk about schools, some of these schools will be under public facilities, even hospitals, but they have different complexities and problems. So when you choose to do a school or to do a hospital, these are highly complex already. The design problems are many. And when people ask questions of you that, I don't think your project is complex enough, but because your project is to do with small, tiny buildings, like just now when we talk about the rural area projects, aging infrastructure, how to revitalize them, it has to be a master planning project, and which deals with water bodies or how the land is used, the natural landscape, and even veering into secondary forests. How do you actually deal with permaculture, farms, and sustainability in terms of the ecosystem that takes into account, previous ways of using the land. So, yeah, it's always exciting when it comes to a design thesis topics. And this is your own baby that you're going to be dealing with from the beginning until the end in about a year. And ChatGPT came up with all these topics. And I wanted the curriculum for the postgraduate architecture course, but it came out with these topics. So I didn't get what I want. So ChatGPT instead gave me typical dissertation topics, but they are considered as well design thesis topics in many universities in this world. So therefore, the students really have to turn it into viable design thesis. And my perspective comes from what I have experience, which is in Malaysia is focused on that it has to be architecture and not planning. But I disagree with that. I think that Malaysian schools of architecture with design thesis, you can deal with planning, and that all of these topics can be done by a Malaysian student. A student in a Malaysian school of architecture. So there you go. This is the third installation or third part of ChatGPT topic, what is the university curriculum, postgraduate architecture design thesis. And this is how I interpret seemingly generic topics generated by artificial intelligence into a design thesis project. So I hope that you've enjoyed all three parts, and I hope that it has been informative enough for you to think about these things and the relevance of ChatGPT in education, in particular in architecture education. Thank you for listening.